Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and we're so grateful that you can join us. And in this first hour here, going to focus a fair amount on the state of Texas because we've been paying attention to some of the individuals that were responsible for or held responsible for some of the things that happened just 2 weeks ago. The CEO of ERCOT, Bill Magnus, actually has stepped down, actually was let go. He makes over $800,000 every year, which is about what a lot of us make in 10 years. So pretty good job. Deanne Walker, who is the head of the Public Utilities Commission, has resigned. So we'll get into some of that. A lot of questions related to the snow and the energy lockdowns, people in the dark, in the cold. So we'll be talking about that. Of course, a decision coming down from the governor about no longer having a mask mandate. And Keith Olbermann, you remember Keith Olbermann? Okay, well, he said, why are we wasting vaccines on Texas if Texas has decided to join the side of the virus? This man has more opinions as a sports broadcaster than even Dale Hansen. So anyway, we'll get into some of that. And we have a judge arrested on 150 counts of voter fraud. You know that supposedly never takes place right here in the state of Texas. So we have lots to talk about. And in the first half hour, we're going to spend some time with our good friend, Representative Matt Krause, grew up in San Antonio, is an individual who has been not only a constitutional attorney, but a college professor on American history, an individual that brings so much to this expertise and represents the 93rd District in the area of Tarrant County and joins us now by phone. So, Representative Matt Krause, welcome back to Point of View.
Hey, thanks for having me, Kerby. It's always good to be on with you, and there's no shortage of things to talk about today, so glad to be on with you.
Even in the state of Texas. So we have a lot to talk nationally, and after we let you go, we will get into some of the others. Of course, Joe Biden criticizing the decision about the mask as Neanderthal thinking, so we'll get to that later. And, of course, we have all sorts of questions about the CDC and some of the hearings right now on the riots at the Capitol and much, much more. But I was watching you on Twitter, and there was something that was posted by John Cornyn, which said ERCOT actually requests that the Department of Energy issue an order immediately authorizing all electric generating units to operate up to their maximum generation output levels. And I love Matt Krause says, not sure why this wasn't done days ago. So there is a lot of questions that people need to be asking, and it sounds like you've been asking some of them as well.
That's right. And it's been a full court press from the governor, lieutenant governor, speaker, the House, the Senate. Everybody is trying to get to the bottom of how this could happen in Texas in 2021, where people could go days without power, without water. And it was just a terrible stretch of days. And so we're hopefully going to learn a lot of lessons. One of them that I didn't even know that Senator Cornyn was alluding to, that the state of Texas, even though we have our own grid, somehow had to ask permission to the federal government to generate more electricity because it may have violated some of their green standards. And so, unfortunately, there was a lot of deficiencies in the system that came to light during those several days. And the legislature is committed to making sure that we remedy those deficiencies so that they never happen again.
And again, let's try to be fair, because on the one hand, hand, some people want to place all the blame on so-called green energy and alternative energy. And yes, the windmills froze and a number of other things, so that's true. But also we had a situation where natural gas, which is something for which we have a tremendous abundance, many of those power plants shut down as well. So you can't necessarily point the finger to one issue. And of course, everything has already become pretty politicized. But at the same time, we will be fair to say that you don't have these kinds of weather patterns too often. After I went through a week of this in Dallas, we had scheduled for me to go to Alaska. So I'm in North Pole, Alaska. And 2 weeks ago in North Pole, Alaska, it was warmer there that day than it was in Dallas-Fort Worth. So this is a pretty unusual situation, but we do have to plan for the extreme situations, don't we?
No, absolutely. And if not, we're not doing our job. Like you said, I mean, the last time we've had these extreme temperatures were decades ago, but there are certain things that you can put in place that you can do over the years to ensure that if another event like this does happen again, that you're protected from it, whether it's winterizing some of the equipment, whether it's making sure that certain kinds of energy can come on board faster next time when you need that to be generated. And as you said, a lot of the blame is gone. It depends on which side of the political aisle you're on, right? Where the blame is gone for this. But you're right. The wind turbines did freeze, and so they were not producing energy. But we also had wellheads frozen for the natural gas that weren't allowing us to get that energy there. So we've got to look at it every situation across the board on where things failed, where they could be better. I will tell you that natural gas and our fossil fuels greatly picked up the lag from some of our other energy sources. And so we need to make sure we continue to have an ability to produce that kind of energy, because it really did come through for us when we really needed it more than anything else. But we have to look at all sectors of our energy society and production and delivery and make sure this doesn't happen again.
Well, again, there are some questions that we've talked about on this program before. I know that you're familiar with Senator Bob Hall, and on more than one occasion, we've talked with him about the fact that we really want to protect the Texas electric grid from, an EMP that could be generated by the sun, could be generated by a terrorist. And so even though almost always when he's brought that up, and I know that some of your colleagues in the Texas House have also brought that up, it's fallen on deaf ears. Maybe now we can say, okay, protecting the grid from an EMP, protecting it from radical Arctic blasts is a really good idea, and it's going to cost some money, but it's money well spent, right?
Yes, no, you're exactly right. And to your point, we can't get so myopic that we have to save the grid from weather issues that we forget about these others that you were saying. In California several years ago, a grid was taken down for a while because of acts of terrorism. And so whether it's nationally occurring EMPs from solar flares, whether that's intentionally done by bad actors, or whether it's local terrorists seeking to take down the grid, we've got to protect our grid. Texas is in a wonderful place. Most of the country is on one grid or another. Texas has its own, and so that comes with advantages, but it also comes with responsibilities. And so we've got to do what we can to protect it all across the board, just like you were saying.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we will continue our conversation with Representative Matt Krause. If you would like to know more about him, and I'd encourage you to go to our website because we have a link there, or you can simply go to mattkrause.org. Krause is spelled with a K, and he has been on the program with us many times before, but if you would like to follow some of the issues he has been addressing, many of those involve things like pro-life and religious liberty and much more. We'll come back and talk about some of the things that he will be addressing. We've already talked about, of course, the energy grid. I'm going to get his thoughts briefly about this idea of removing the mask mandate. And then, of course, you have a lot of other issues in Congress that are being discussed. But, of course, the legislatures have to discuss some other issues. One of those is reapportionment. I want to get his thoughts about that. And also, unlike Congress, they have to balance the budget. So they've got a lot in front of them, and we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
No doubt you've heard the phrase politics is downstream from culture. It is a way of explaining that what is at stake in our world often begins upstream in the culture. Popular culture is all around us and delivered to us through broadcast media and social media. We perceive the world through news reports, through movies, through entertainment programs, and through music. Every form of communication has a message. Sometimes it's blatant and intentional. Often it is subtle and not even perceived by the artist, actor, musician, or broadcaster. He or she may simply be telling a story, but that story comes from a worldview perspective. A wise and discerning Christian should frequently ask, what message is being delivered? Is the viewpoint true or false? How does it line up with biblical principles? Well, let's face it, many of us merely accept what we read, see, and hear uncritically. And that brings us to politics. We are bombarded by messages every day. Most Americans watch lots of television, listen to a fair amount of music, and visit various websites. Unless they are approaching all of the entertainment with lots of discernment, they'll begin to accept the worldview perspective of the writer, the actor, the director, the musician who controls the story and the perspective. Most of these stories come from a liberal, secular viewpoint that often becomes easier to embrace. If someone stood up and lectured to you about abortion, homosexuality, gender identity, your guard would be up. But if the stories portray liberals, feminists, and gays in a positive light, they get into our head and emotions. And if they portray conservatives and Christians in a negative light, the same thing happens. All this to say that we need to pay attention to popular culture because politics is downstream from culture. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Representative Matt Krause, representing the 93rd District in the state of Texas. And if you would like to know more about him, we have a link to mattkrause.org. You know, I was talking to someone, and I said, we're going to be interviewing Matt Krause. And I said, now, which one is he? And I said, the one with a cute family. I mean, that's why you got to go to your website, if nothing else. You know, beautiful wife, cute, 5 cute kids. I hear you have a teenager now. Pray for this man. But nevertheless, it is certainly, it looks like a TV family, and it's just wonderful, if nothing else, to go to the website just to see your family. But let's talk about the mask mandate. You know, we've had Keith Overman, Michael Moore, all sorts of people saying, and of course, even the President of the United States saying that this is Neanderthal thinking. He was talking not only about the governor of Texas, but the governor of Mississippi. But I do get the feeling that there are some businesses there in your district that are just saying it is time to get back to something that is normal. And when we have to protect a few people, let's protect them. But at the same time, we can't have lockdowns, and we can't have the schools closed, and we can't always tell businesses to wait another year. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's right. I think the governor's announcement this week was welcome news. I know it was panned by a lot of liberal critics and liberal politicians across the country. First thing I think we have to understand is this puts Texas right in line where Florida has been for several months now. And you haven't seen the skyrocketing deaths. You haven't seen a huge increase in the cases. I mean, Florida is still very much in line with your other big states all around the country. And so I think the other thing we have to remember is just because the government is no longer mandating that you wear a mask wherever you go, that doesn't mean you can't. I've talked to a lot of people in the last couple of days. They say, we're so worried now we're not going to have to wear a mask. I said, you can still wear a mask wherever you want to go. You can patron those businesses that still make you wear a mask when you're inside of them, and there's plenty of those. And so I think it's actually a good thing that the governor's rescinded that mask mandate and has now left it up to the good judgment of individuals, which is the way I think life is run best when the government is not micromanaging your life, but letting people make the best decisions for themselves. And so, as you said, we can be cautious. We can be cognizant of those who are in a category that are prone to the COVID and its effects, but let everybody else go back and live lives and continue their livelihoods. And so I think it's a good thing, and I'm glad Texas is going to be more open starting next week than it has been the last several months.
Let's talk about some of the challenges you face in this particular set of circumstances. First of all, every 10 years, of course, you have to do reapportionment. We've had Representative Phil King on this program. But again, because of the very significant amount of population growth, you'll still have 150 members of the Texas House. But those districts are going to be drawn in some pretty unusual ways. And that's something that is, of course, front and center right now in the legislature, isn't it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And what compounds that even more is that we usually get the census data from what they did in 2020 or the year that they do the census. We usually get that information right at the beginning of April, which allows us to draw a map so everything's in place by the time we're supposed to have our primary elections in March. This time, because of the coronavirus and different things and different, waiting times for getting that data, now the data folks are telling us we're not going to get that till September. So I think you're going to be looking at a primary that does not take place in March this time in Texas. It's probably going to be maybe May, maybe June.
Wow.
And so that's going to make things even a little different as well. But because Texas has continued to grow and Texas has continued to thrive, I think we're going to be looking at 2, possibly 3 new congressional seats.
That's true.
That we will draw. And so you're right. Texas will still have 150 state reps. You'll still have 31 senators. But we're going to expand our reach on congressional seats. And so we'll see where those go and how those wind up. So it's the first time I've been a part of a redistricting redrawing session. And so everybody says, get ready. It'll be very interesting. But with the data coming out later, we'll probably take that up. We'll have to take that up in a special session in the fall instead of doing it during the regular session as we usually try to do.
Very interesting. Of course, as we've also talked about earlier, that maybe 3 new congressional seats, and that will affect not only congressional representation, but the Electoral College. But something else that is key, and I've talked about this before with former state senator, now member of Congress, Van Taylor, don't have to balance a budget in Congress, but you do. And I know in the past that you've had various bills that you've put forward on trying to limit the rate of growth of various appropriations, trying to address some of these issues. And this has been made more difficult because of COVID, as you just pointed out. It hasn't been as bad as some feared, but still you're going to try to have to balance a budget when there are going to be a lot of people that are going to want to pull everything out of the rainy day fund. And so some of the most pitched battles are going to have to do with trying to balance a budget, aren't they?
You're exactly right. And Kirby, as you said, we have to balance our budget. It's a mandate here in Texas, which is a good mandate. And so we're going to have to find a way to do it. But tax sales revenue is down because of the pandemic that wiped out a bunch of economic activity for several months. We all remember how oil was kind of going crazy parts last year, even getting to negative numbers, which was just kind of surreal. So we don't have as much oil and gas severance revenue as we usually do. And so that's all going to shape up for about $1 billion shortfall in Texas. And so we're going to have to make some tough choices. We're going to have to make sure our priorities are our priorities to make sure we do balance that budget. It'll be some sacrificing in some ways, but we'll get it done. And we'll make sure we fund our priorities in the process.
Before we run out of time, let's talk about any bills that you are promoting. I know that in the past you've had bills that relate to the First Amendment, bills that relate to the Second Amendment, bills that relate to some of the social issues from abortion and pornography and LGBT and same-sex and bathrooms and transgenderism. But what are some of the issues that you're focusing on right now?
Yeah, we're focused a lot on making sure that we learn lessons from the pandemic, not just from a health standpoint, but from a policy and governance standpoint. our statutes and our statutory framework were never set up to be utilized for long, drawn-out national disasters or pandemics and things like that. So the disaster declarations, emergency powers that are given to our executives, either at the state, local, county levels, we need to look at that to make sure that we're not violating separation of powers, and we're not just putting the burden of governing 29 million people on one person, even during a pandemic or drawn-out thing. So we've got some various bills that would reform executive power here in Texas and reframe that and put it in the right statutory framework. So we're working on that quite a bit. As you said, we've got a spending limit bill to make sure Texas doesn't overspend itself. Even with a balanced budget, sometimes we can use various funds to kind of move some of that around. So we want some stricter spending limits here in Texas. We've got a bill on gender modification. We're seeing that take place with those under 18 more and more. And so we've got a bill that says, hey, if that's what you want to do, you need to be 18 or older before you make these life-altering, sometimes irreparable decisions before you're even allowed to vote. And so we've got bills that kind of run the spectrum from, like you said, the fiscal areas to governance areas to the social issues. And so our office is busy, but I'm excited about what we might be able to get done. And then as a body, protecting your Second Amendment, especially from what Washington, D.C. is trying to look at and trying to do, is very important to us. We've got a few Second Amendment protection bills that we filed. So we've got them all over the place, but I'm excited to get to work once we hit that ability to have legislation on the floor, hopefully get some great things done for Texans during this session.
And it's going to be very fast and furious because, like you said, you have to wait until you can vote on certain things unless they're emergencies. So you're going to be very busy. So I encourage our listeners to pray for Matt Krause, and I encourage you to visit the website, mattkrause.org, and we have that on our website at pointofview.net. So thank you for joining us today.
Hey, thanks, Kirby. It's always a pleasure to be with you. You're one of the best in the business, so keep up the good work and appreciate all the work you do.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, I'm going to get into some issues, but I thought I would mention that the last couple of days, the take action item has been the Equality Act. We've changed it now, so if you have not taken the time to go to the website, please do so, because the take action item today has to do with H.R. 1 for the People Act, and this is the one which would completely federalize and take some of the worst practices of election 2020 and make them mandatory nationwide. So there are all sorts of reasons to oppose it. But it isn't just us. The next hour, I'll go into this in more detail, but I have in front of me here an op-ed that comes from two individuals with the American Civil Liberties Union. Okay, this is the ACLU. On the one hand, they like the fact that the bill tries to address some issues like voting rights and election security, but they are absolutely convinced that this bill is flawed and would be, I'm quoting them, detrimental to the health of our democracy and likely have unintended consequences on the political rights of non-citizen immigrants. You know you have a bad bill when even the ACLU is saying thumbs down. Now, they have the belief that maybe we can fix it. It's not fixable, but nevertheless, all the more reason for you to go to the website, pointofview.net, and let your two senators know about H.R. 1. We'll be right back.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook. Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I'll kind of stay on the Texas Hour a little bit longer and then move on to some other issues. But as a program note, let me mention about a half an hour from now, we'll have our friend George Barna on, and we'll be talking about a number of issues, the reports that he has brought, and especially the surveys that he has done after the election have been really amazing. One of the articles I've posted, we've talked about it before, but it's worth coming back to, that they're all all sorts of areas of common ground where you have a supermajority of Republicans and Democrats that agree with that. And those issues deserve some attention because you could get very quick support from those individuals. Sometimes you can't get support from those members of Congress. Like, for example, charter schools. There are all sorts of people who believe in school choice, charter schools, and the rest, but the teachers' unions don't, so oftentimes you can't get the Democratic leadership to go along with that. But Republicans and Democrats agree with that. Infrastructure, balancing a budget, all sorts of issues you can have agreement. But instead, as we'll point out, the agenda items for the Biden administration are those where you don't have a majority of sometimes even Democrats, but certainly not Republicans, and certainly not of Americans agreeing with that issue. And that's the stuff that is getting forced through at the moment. So we'll be talking about that with him. One of the other interesting revelations from his post-election survey is support for socialism has dropped significantly. So we'll talk about that a little bit with him. Then in the next hour, Jim Denison will be with us. He posted an article many weeks ago on the whole issue of Christian nationalism. We'll get into that. He also today talks about whether we should avoid, say, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because of moral issues. So I'm going to get into that. And by the way, I'll also talk about that in terms of some of the CDC guidelines. Maybe I'll get to that this hour, but we'll certainly cover it with him later about whether or not once a person's vaccinated, they can go back to business as usual. And so far, the CDC keeps postponing that. I think there's a very good reason, because if you do get the vaccine, then you could be with other people, and we could end up very quickly having a two-tiered society. We're saying if you have the vaccine, then you have total freedom, and if you don't, you don't. And anyway, it will be some interesting conversation with him about that as well. So those are some topics we will cover in the next couple of hours. I might just also mention, in just a few minutes, we're going to get into the issue of immigration. Very prominent Democrat in the state of Texas. He's not the only one, by the way. Really expressing very significant frustration, even though he's a Democrat, even though he supports Joe Biden, even though he voted for Joe Biden. He is very frustrated with this administration on the way they are mishandling what is happening at the border. So we'll talk about that. When we do get into this issue of election integrity, I've posted a very good piece by Mike Pence. You remember him, former vice president, and that kind of gets into H.R. 1, which we, of course, have as our action item today. And then Doug Groteis, who oftentimes is with us on Friday. I don't think he'll be with us Friday, but he'll be with us next Friday. A very good piece on phobias and logic. And I'm always wanting you to have good critical thinking skills. So somewhere, hopefully, we'll be able to get into that. If not, I'll postpone it till tomorrow. Okay, real quickly. Voter fraud. You know that thing that never happens? Okay, we now have a judge in the state of Texas that has been arrested on 150 counts of voter fraud. He's actually one of 3 individuals that have actually been arrested. Again, to be fair, just because you've been arrested, just because you've been charged, doesn't mean you're guilty. You're innocent till proven guilty. But it's a good illustration of, at a time when the Supreme Court almost seems to be given the unwillingness to even look at some of these swing state voter fraud cases, we have a good example right here in the state of Texas. Of course, as one person said, I think he was probably being somewhat facetious, of course, this is just an isolated case. These individuals, including this judge, are charged with organized election fraud. They face multiple charges of illegal voting, unlawful possession of a ballot, unlawful possession of a ballot envelope, election fraud, fraudulent use of an absentee ballot by mail, tampering with a government record, and purportedly acting as an agent. There's quite a bit there, isn't there? Now, according to the Texas Attorney General's office, this case involves allegations of vote harvesting at a number of living centers where that has taken place. And again, to be fair, the individual, and I've not said his name because I don't want him to come back and want to sue us or something like that, but he has said he was stunned by the allegations. But as you read his response, he says, well, this comes because former President Donald Trump alleges that the election was illegitimate because of voter fraud. First of all, Donald Trump did not bring this allegation. It is the Attorney General of the state of Texas. And as I've said before, there are very few prosecutions of voter fraud because you have to do a lot of work for not a lot of impact, because oftentimes there tends to be a fine. There are a couple of cases that I've been documenting where people go to jail, but it's usually a very short sentence. And so this has always been the problem, because you've had some groups that allege that there's no voter fraud or there's not a lot of it, simply like the Brennan Center and others that have simply said this is not the case. Well, think about this. If you're a district attorney and you have all sorts of cases on your desk, and one of those cases has to do with voter fraud, and the voter fraud may have not made any difference in the election, and you have to pull together all sorts of resources in order to then take it to a court and prove in a court of law that the voter fraud took place, and then at the end the person gets fined, but maybe nothing else. And you've got all these other cases which involve burglary and murder and all sorts of other things, carjacking. Guess where you're going to put your time in? So in some respects, kudos to the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, who even pointed out a while back that he says, I have very few people in my office that are even devoted to the issue of voter fraud. So it's difficult even for him to do so. But this one, I think, has been one of the more high-profile cases because this is a judge, an actual justice of the peace, and others that have been arrested for voter fraud. So if you have people say, we have no evidence of voter fraud, well, yes, we do. And I thought I'd just let you know that that exists. Let's get into the issue of immigration. I brought that up yesterday because I have to make a correction. If you heard me yesterday pointing out that the Obama administration said that they would consider a crisis at the border to be one where there were 1,000 crossings a day, I pointed out that we'd had 4,000 crosses a day just recently. So as a result, that's 4 times as much. I underestimated. It really was 6,000 crossings a day. And the reason for it is, yes, there were 4 on this. I'm just taking one of these days. The Border Patrol actually said there were 4,700 people trying to illegally enter the United States. So 1,000 to 4,000. But I found out, due to James Carafano, who's at the Heritage Foundation, that 4,700 did not include 2 other groups. There were about 900 that were observed but not detained, and an additional 400 that were detained and sent back. So that would be 1,300 added to 4,700. Again, I always jokingly say I went to a government school, so maybe my math's not too good, but I think 4,700 and 1,300 end up being 6,000. And so the number I used was low because I didn't count in some of the others. And so we are at a crisis that is 6 times larger than what was existing during the Obama administration. And I learned something else by reading Joseph Carafano, which I did not know. When that statement was made under the Barack Obama administration, the argument that 1,000 attempted crossings a day was a crisis was a standard that was set by the current, at that time, the current vice president, that would be Joe Biden, who is now the president, and at that time, Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, who is now the actual Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, who I quoted yesterday. So it was their standard a little bit more than 4 years ago, it's about 6 years ago, in which they were saying, that is Joe Biden and the current Secretary of Homeland Security, who was at that time the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, that 1,000 crossings a day was a crisis. Of course, now the current secretary says, well, it's a challenge, but it's not a crisis. So when we come back from the break, I want to point you to the first article we have here, in which we hear from Representative Henry Cuellar, who is a Democrat and an individual that has been looking at what is taking place at the border and has expressed very significant frustration with what is happening at the border. And so this is sort of a Texas story, but I may come back to it again in the next national hour as well, because it illustrates the fact that we are having the press not covering it, and then even when they do, they're allowing the Biden administration to say it's really not a crisis. Hold on, we've got it all covered. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking for a few minutes about the crisis at the border, which the Biden administration says is only a challenge and not a crisis. But Representative Henry Cuellar, who's a Democrat in the state of Texas, would disagree. And so I have posted as the first article for you to read, because you're not going to hear the press talking about this very much. Texas Democrat sounds alarm on pending Biden immigration crisis. The impression is that the border is open. And so he talks about how this is becoming a crisis. And Representative Henry Cuellar, he said, sent pictures to the Houston Chronicle that he had received showing a Customs and Border Protection facility crowded with not just men, but also women and young children, to drive home what he says, the stark reality that a surge in illegal border crossings has been driven by families and unaccompanied minors. Have we heard this before? Of course we have. Another story took the country by storm and helped spur the administration back when President Barack Obama was in office to take some action. What Henry Cuellar said, quote, "I had to release those pictures because they were keeping it very, very quiet," unquote. He says now, almost 7 years later, he is suggesting that a similar dynamic is emerging under President Obama's former vice president, which is now the current president, Joe Biden. And so Henry Cuellar said, quote, "I'm a Democrat and I support this administration. I supported the Obama administration, but sometimes I think they need to do more and listen to border communities." His big concern, and I've seen him say this elsewhere, is that it seems like the administration right now is listening only to the activists. Well, that's no real big surprise to me. But again, he was concerned about the press conference by Alejandro Mayorkas, who is the Secretary of Homeland Security. And he says that if nothing else, he says, I feel like some of my fellow Democrats have this kind of let everyone in kind of rhetoric, which is not good. Let me use a Texas example, which I may not use in the National Hour. He says, quote, "For example, why is it that in the Del Rio sector you have lots of Cubans and Haitians coming in, that in the Laredo sector, as of a week ago, 73% were Mexican single adults, and then in the Rio Grande Valley, a great part of them are family units or unaccompanied kids, and a lot of them from Central America." So he goes on to say, so why is it that the different folks go to different sectors? By accident? No, it's by design. I think what he's pointing out here is, if nothing else, you have kind of this direction from the coyotes. And coyotes are not animals, as unfortunately some members of Congress did not understand when that phrase was used by President or former President Donald Trump. But the people that are actually trafficking, matter of fact, did you see that crash yesterday of the SUV where that was human trafficking that crossed in front of that truck and killed so many of the individuals? But anyway, this is, I think, illustrating that this is not just people randomly coming, but it's by design. And Congressman Henry Cuellar, a Democrat, is pointing that out. He also brought out something that I've talked about, and it's now getting mentioned by a few members of Congress. I quoted yesterday Senator Tom Cotton, because he said the Border Patrol does not check detainees for COVID, while restrictions on millions of border visa holders who bring millions and billions of dollars in business remain in place, creating a double whammy that is frustrating his constituents. So on the one hand, you have people that are waiting to get in because of COVID restrictions. And on the other hand, you have illegals coming here and they're not even being tested for COVID. And when the test that was done in Brownsville, that's the only one I've seen so far, was done, and let's assume that the test was accurate and that they tested a large number, but they came up with at least 6% that have COVID. And I suspect that number is probably low because sometimes they only find out after the fact that others had it. And these are people going into the general population. And I predict right now that when you see an upswing in cases for COVID, everybody's going to blame the removal of the mask mandate. And that may be partially true, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of it, if you were really honest, has to do with the fact that we're allowing so many people to come in that are actually COVID positive and are super spreaders in some of these communities. Anyway, Henry Cuellar also goes on to say that his perception is that the Biden administration, quote, is only listening to the activists at the expense of border communities. He went on to say, look, quote, it's okay to listen to the immigration activists and advocates, but he goes on to say, but the other side of the formula is to listen to the border communities, and you've got to balance your approach. When you listen to both sides and not just the immigrant activists that many times lives thousands of miles away from the border. So, as you can tell, he is very frustrated with what is trying here right now, and has been concerned that some of those issues are going to be changed. Matter of fact, he also warned that Title 42, which is a public health order that came under Donald Trump, that they are now talking about the fact that they want to get rid of that. And I mentioned to you yesterday, there were some of his fellow members of Congress calling for that. And this would, Title 42 allows officials to quickly expel migrant families and adults during the pandemic, if for no other reason, to actually not bring more into this country. And if I understand the letter that come from his fellow members of Congress, it's, no, we want to bring them into this country. We don't want to send COVID back to the other countries. You just can't make this stuff up. But nevertheless, this is the first article. And if you find yourself saying, I'm only hearing about this immigration crisis on Point of View, you need to ask your local radio stations, your local television stations, why, as I pointed out just a minute ago, the crisis at the border is 6 times higher than it was during the time when it was called a crisis under the Obama administration. And there is a real need to address some of these issues right now. And Henry Cuellar is, at least to his credit, trying to call some attention to it. Let's take a break. Come back. We look forward to talking with our good friend George Barna. And, of course, we'll also be talking in the next hour with Jim Denison. I think you'll appreciate both of those conversations. We'll also get into some of these other topics, including one on election integrity. The former Vice President Mike Pence has written some very good pieces about that, and in particular expresses his concern about H.R. 1, which is now passed the House and has gone to the Senate. This was a bill that shouldn't have passed last year, shouldn't have passed this year, and it certainly should not be actually focused on in the Senate, but we will have to see where that takes us. So if you have already responded, as we have in the last couple of days, to the Equality Act, this is different now. This one is on H.R. 1, which has already passed the House. Now it's gone to the Senate. Once again, we give you some talking points there. You can click on the button that says contact your senators, put in your zip code, and it will then, of course, surface your 2 senators. And if you're in Texas, of course, that's John Cornyn and Ted Cruz, but some of you are listening in other states as well. And we give you a suggested letter that you can edit, and then you can send it off. So these are 2 pieces of legislation that we are deeply concerned about. And if you have not taken the time to visit the website, we have a very good take action item for you today. My commentary today is on politics and culture, and if you don't have a chance to read that, you might want to print that out. Of course, if you click on there, there's a place where you can also click the button that says Never Miss a Viewpoint. That is a place for you to sign up and receive it in your inbox. Monday through Friday, my commentaries come, and on Saturday, of course, Benedictures come. Let's take a break. We're going to spend some time talking with George Barna. We've learned a lot since the election, and we'll be talking about that right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information. about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I think you guys, y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and over the next 2 hours, we're going to cover quite a bit. In just a minute, we're going to talk with our good friend George Barna, who is a professor at Arizona Christian University, president of the Culture Research Center. And in the past, we've talked about some of the post-election studies that he has done. So we'll talk about that first, and then get into some other issues. Later this hour, we're going to talk about the fact that there is a crisis at the border, worse than the press is even talking about, if they're talking about it at all. We also have a piece that we've posted on election integrity, written by the former Vice President Mike Pence, because our action item today is on H.R. 1, which is passed the House of Representatives and now is in the Senate. Just a few days ago, actually last couple of days, we've encouraged you to contact your two senators about the Equality Act. Now we want to encourage you to contact your two senators about this particular piece of legislation that would federalize election and take probably the worst practices of election 2020 and implement them. We'll also try to get into the fact that the CDC vaccine guidelines have not been issued, and there may be some reasons for that. And there have been some hearings on the Capitol riots, and we've learned a lot more about some of the things that happened, and even some of the attempts to try to refer to all of that as an insurrection, even an armed insurrection, when the evidence goes just the opposite way. But let's first spend some time with our good friend George Barna. He's been on this program many times before. An individual has written more than 50 books and is the head of the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University. And George, thank you for joining us today on Point of View.
Oh, thanks for having me, Kerby.
You know, this post-election survey that you have done has been something that we've talked about with you on a number of occasions. I've done 2 commentaries on it, but I thought I'd come back to it for just a minute, because one of the things that you found is that you can identify about a half a dozen issues easily in which you have a supermajority of both Republicans and Democrats, where these really are bipartisan issues that you could really push through easily through Congress if you wanted to. And yet, unfortunately, what we're finding right now are the issues that you found were very contentious and difficult. Those seem to be the ones that the Biden administration are trying to push through right now. So in some respects, you've shown that we do have still a bipartisan ability, but we need to have members of Congress and the president understand that those are the issues we should be focusing some time and attention on.
Yeah, I think what it really raises is the question of, are we serious about unifying the country? Are we serious about being a republic? You know, there are a lot of very basic questions that I think are being raised by the actions that we're seeing coming out of D.C. these days. And unfortunately, the answers that you have to come to when you look at the kinds of legislative priorities that we see coming out of the Congress and the White House is that, no, unity is not really the underlying priority here in America. There's a different kind of agenda. There's an ideological agenda that has to be behind what's going on, that has nothing to do with what do the American people want. What are they looking to their elected officials to do for them in order to create the kind of country that we would be proud of and that we really want to get behind and support?
And again, when we're talking about supermajority, we're talking about 70%, sometimes more than 80% of Americans, for example, support the idea of expanding the domestic manufacturing base or support the notion of investing in improvement in our infrastructure. Of course, trying to make Social Security and Medicare solvent or dealing with federal debt, those kinds of things. These are big issues and important issues, and it's not where you would have to basically convince very many people in the country that these are important ideas. It would be very easy to move ahead on some of those, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it sure would. And, the amazing thing is that when we talk about this being a supermajority, in the report, we even broke it down by Trump voters and Biden voters. And what we were finding was that there were nearly the same proportion of Trump voters as Biden voters who were supporting the 6 different policy possibilities that we raised in the report. So, yeah, it will be very easy to get almost universal support for those kind of functions. And then when you look at the policies that are coming out of D.C. now that they're trying to push through the House and the Senate in terms of health care, in terms of fossil fuels, in terms of wealth redistribution and so forth, those kinds of things do not have widespread support. In some cases, they don't even have majority support from the Biden constituency. And so you have to wonder what these individuals think they were elected to do, how it is that they define their role, and what that has to do with the Constitution.
And again, just before we take a break, let's mention some of those because, again, we have a link to what is available there at Arizona Christian University and, of course, also through your work at the Cultural Research Center. But at the very top of the list were some of the ones I mentioned. Let's look about some of the bottom of the list. For example, increasing the number of U.S. Supreme Court justices from 9 to 13. That one's very low on the issue. Another one you mentioned just in passing, eliminating the use of fossil fuels as part of the Green New Deal. And as you point out, it isn't that you don't get supporters of Donald Trump in the last election agreeing with that. You don't even, in many cases, get supporters of Joe Biden that agree with that. So these are so far down your list of issues that are simply not ones that people would necessarily support, and yet that seems to be exactly where the focus and time and attention is. And it's once again an illustration that if we really wanted unity, if we really wanted to have some of that bipartisan support that used to exist, for example, between Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill being the Speaker of the House, Ronald Reagan being the President, that just doesn't seem to exist right now, and it's a sad commentary on the leadership both in the Oval Office and in Congress.
Absolutely true. And I think this is one of those cases where it's imperative that the American people be in communication with the people that they've sent to D.C. and let them know, you know what, you're really not representing what I'm looking you to do. You were put into office to represent me, not for me to support whatever it is that you want. And so helping them to realign those kinds of perspectives is important. And it can only happen if the people in D.C. recognize that the American people are awake. We understand what's going on. We have real concerns.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into one other issue from the post-election survey. That was the one on socialism, which we've also done some commentaries on. But we've got and have a really great opportunity for you to connect up with the Cultural Research Center. And if you haven't signed up to get some of their resources, we have a link to that today. And I've also posted a piece which says Common Ground. And when you go into that, you can see for yourself just kind of a brief summary of the very significant number of issues for which there is a supermajority, and then, of course, the very controversial issues on everything from fossil fuels to gun ownership to health care to wealth redistribution or abortion and a variety of others. And I think you will find that very helpful, and maybe even something you could use to send to your elected representatives to say, why aren't we focusing on the things we all agree on instead of focusing on the things that people of both political parties disagree about? We'll take a break and continue our conversation with George Barna right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
No doubt you've heard the phrase politics is downstream from culture. It is a way of explaining that what is at stake in our world often begins upstream in the culture. Popular culture is all around us and delivered to us through broadcast media and social media. We perceive the world through news reports, through movies, through entertainment programs, and through music. Every form of communication has a message. Sometimes it's blatant and intentional. Often it is subtle and not even perceived by the artist, actor, musician, or broadcaster. He or she may simply be telling a story, but that story comes from a worldview perspective. A wise and discerning Christian should frequently ask, what message is being delivered? Is the viewpoint true or false? How does it line up with biblical principles? Well, let's face it, many of us merely accept what we read, see, and hear uncritically. And that brings us to politics. We are bombarded by messages every day. Most Americans watch lots of television, listen to a fair amount of music, and visit various websites. Unless they are approaching all of the entertainment with lots of discernment, they'll begin to accept the worldview perspective of the writer, the actor, the director, the musician who controls the story and the perspective. Most of these stories come from a liberal, secular viewpoint that often becomes easier to embrace. If someone stood up and lectured to you about abortion, homosexuality, gender identity, your guard would be up. But if the stories portray liberals, feminists, and gays in a positive light, they get into our head and emotions. And if they portray conservatives and Christians in a negative light, the same thing happens. All this to say that we need to pay attention to popular culture because politics is downstream from culture. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
George Barna with us of the Cultural Research Center, and we've been talking about the post-election survey, and I want to get to in just a minute the information about faith and the worldview of Biden supporters and something else. But one of the other things before we do that, George Barna, is that you have also asked questions about socialism, and that was very interesting to me, and I have found myself sharing that whenever I speak. I've, of course, done a commentary on it. We have this booklet that we developed about a year ago on capitalism and socialism, and that is one that I wanted to make available, especially if you have a young person that is convinced that socialism is better than capitalism and maybe doesn't even understand what socialism means. And after developing this one, which primarily, if you will, answers and tries to respond to some of the criticism socialists have about capitalism, I more recently, and this just came out, produced this booklet on socialism, which takes some of the arguments for socialism and gives a critique of it. But one of the things that I have been sharing with almost everybody from your survey, your post-election survey, is that you found, really, in some respects to our surprise, that because of some of the things that have been happening during the campaign and people maybe knowing a little bit more about socialism, you found a very significant decline in support for socialism. Matter of fact, the most precipitous decline was among American ages 30 to 49, who just about a decade ago we were saying were the most likely to believe that socialism was superior to capitalism. And so you found that at that age group, you found it even for those over the age of 50 and others. So in some respects, even though it looks like socialist ideas are winning the day, if you do the kind of survey that you do, George Barna, you're finding that's not necessarily the case, is it?
No, that's exactly right. I mean, it was so interesting to me to get this data back, because what we have now is an administration that is going whole hog down the socialist trail. And I think if they were to turn around and look behind them, they wouldn't find very many people behind them saying, yeah, go, go, go. What we found was that there was that 9 percentage point decrease in just the last 2.5 years among American adults saying that they would prefer socialism to capitalism. And when you look at that 30 to 49-year-old age group, basically the baby bust generation, Gen X, whatever you want to call them, there was a 15 percentage point decline among those people. And they're the ones that marketers are always looking to reach, because they're a critical influence in all dimensions of our society. So really, when you look at where is the energy going in our culture, it's not currently moving towards socialism, because as you suggested, what I think happened is in the most recent election, what we had was a pretty clear demonstration of what socialism will be all about, because you had so many candidates who are trumpeting what they would do toward bringing socialism into the country. And so people really were not voting pro-socialism. Most of the people, or many of the people, not most, but a large share of the people who voted for Mr. Biden were not voting for socialism. They were voting not to have Mr. Trump in office for a variety of reasons. But we got to be real careful that we understand what's going on.
Well, and even the Democratic primary, you had a lot of people that eventually voted for Joe Biden because they didn't want to have Bernie Sanders in the Oval Office. So you can kind of see that as well. But I did want to leave a little bit of time. I've not had a chance to read your latest study, but it talks about faith and the worldview of Biden supporters. And it kind of reminds me that another booklet I've done more recently is one on the liberal mind, because trying to understand the worldview of those individuals that vote for Joe Biden and to vote for some of these policies, you've just illustrated that on many cases, even people that were Biden supporters didn't necessarily agree with some of the things now being promoted by the Biden administration, nor did they agree with socialist ideas. But what have you discovered in terms of that issue of faith and worldview there?
Well, what's happening is that you've got two very different groups of people. You have the Trump voters who are primarily theologically conservative. They want to have freedom from government control, reduce government regulation. On the other hand, you got the Biden voters who are not theologically driven. What you find is that large majorities of these people say that it really doesn't matter what faith you buy into, as long as you have some faith in something. A large majority of them would say that all religious faiths are of equal value. A large majority of them say that they are not personally deeply committed to practicing any faith. And a large majority of them would say that they're spiritual but not religious. And that one always kind of gets at me, because when you say that, what you're saying is, my perspective is I have to be true to myself, live in the moment, the ends justify the means. Really, I'm not a sinner. I'm a good person. I can trust myself, and that's really all that matters. So it's a very different approach to how we're going to live as a nation, as a community of people, trying to find some kind of common purpose that we all rally around. They're taking a very different perspective, and it's certainly not a biblical one. We found that only 3 out of every 10 Biden voters believe that the Bible is the actual or the inspired word of God that can be trustworthy and that it's reliable for our lives today. So they're taking a whole different perspective on moral guidance and where they want the country to go.
And an illustration of that happened in Congress just the other day. You had a representative, can't think of his name right at the moment, but a Republican anyway, and he started out by quoting scripture. And when he did so, you could see on the other side of the aisle with the Democrats, there was a rustling and and just it's like he wasn't even saying his words. He was actually quoting from the Bible. And that was causing a real stir, almost a ruckus, which then forced one of the other members from the Republican side of the aisle to call for the speaker, or at that time the person that was the chair, to settle everybody down. So when you quote from the Bible in Congress, as has been done for basically 2 or 3 centuries. When that becomes controversial, it does tell you a little bit, at least, about the leadership on that side of the aisle, doesn't it?
Well, it sure does. And again, if they're reflecting the Biden constituency, recognize that 2 out of 3 Biden voters don't believe in the Holy Spirit. Almost 2 out of 3 of them don't believe in the God of Israel. They're 60% less likely than all other Americans to have a biblical worldview. So, yeah, they're coming at this from a hardcore, personal, individualistic, secular perspective that's going to take us in a very different direction if we're not careful.
Before we let you go, talk about how people can get some of this material. I've encouraged people on a regular basis to simply click on your picture there, and it will take you to the Cultural Research Center. There's a place where you can then say, click here, and then there's a place where you can sign up and receive the latest CRC research findings. And these post-election surveys have just been fascinating. And, of course, the most eye-opening of all of them so far has been the one on socialism, but every one of them is worth attention. And so if people want to sign up, you've made it very easy for them to do so, and it's free, isn't it?
Yeah, everything we do is free. And so if they just go to culturalresearchcenter.com, if they have other issues, they can go there, download whatever they want. We encourage people to share it with others. Share it with your elected representatives. I'm not sure that they're in touch with what the American people really are asking. So much of the polling done in America today is off base, and so we've got to be doing everything we can to keep the people who are representing us informed about reality.
Well, again, George Barna, thank you for joining us. As always, look forward to the next opportunity.
Me too. Thanks so much, Kerby.
Let's take a break, and let me just mention that we do have an action item for the People Act moving to the United States Senate. And, one of the things George Barna was just saying is a lot of these pollsters aren't even asking the right questions. And so you've heard us say before, we want to be your source of truth and information, not only in terms of news and information, but also your source of truth in terms of accurate opinions and accurate survey of opinions. I have just more recently, even with my own organization, done a survey to really look at the mindset of the so-called nones, that is the atheist, agnostic, no preference group that have none of the above in terms of their belief, and talk about the fact that we have actually, in order to have things that were statistically surveying and statistically significant, large numbers, and George Barna does the same kind of thing. So not only is it very good surveys, but it's very good questions, and in many cases, questions that nobody else is asking. So this is one more reason why I hope you'll support Point of View. But then we come back from the break. I look like there's some calls coming in, so I'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. I do want to get into some of the issues in the news, and in about a half an hour, we'll be talking with our good friend Jim Denison. But our action item today for the People Act, H.R. 1, it's now gone to the U.S. Senate. We need you to contact your 2 United States senators, and you can do that by going to the website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out to Missouri first, KTTK. Janet, thank you for calling us today here on Point of View.
Thank you. And hi, Kerby. I have a question, and I'm not for sure if it's true or not, but I had heard that the $1.9 trillion is supposed to include $21,000 for federal employees to be able to stay home. Do you know anything about that, or something that you might want to look up over the next few days?
Oh, I do know about that. It is, actually, I even know the page. It's page 305, and it is a special benefit, if you will, to federal workers who have children that are enrolled in school, but they are not back full time. And so it allocates about $570 million. I think that $21,000 you're talking about is in terms of where the cutoff is for the benefit, whether you get it, but nevertheless, it is a package that many people have been somewhat critical about, and you can read about that. I've found articles in everything from Forbes to Fox News about it, so it's pretty well documented, and it illustrates again that if you're a federal employee and the administration is convinced that it's dangerous for you to go back to work and it's dangerous for kids to go back to school, then we're going to provide you with benefits. And I wasn't going to get into it today, but I might as well mention, one of the big controversies coming out right now of Los Angeles is, even though a lot of parents want their kids to go back to school, what you've had is the head of the teachers union there has been saying, well, this is just a bunch of white racists that are trying to force the schools to actually convene. The reality is a lot of the white parents that have any money probably put their kids in a tutoring program or in a private school. The ones that are getting hurt in the Los Angeles school district now are mostly African American, Hispanic American. I mean, think about trying to keep a 6-year-old's attention on Zoom. and you got low income families that many of them have to go out and work. And so they are finding that struggle of trying to have their kids work. And so in some respects, while we are penalizing some of these parents that are maybe at the poverty level, or maybe they're the working poor, at the same time, we're saying, well, if you're a federal worker and you have children enrolled in school that is not resumed full-time, we're going to give you a benefit. And so far, I think it's about $570 million, with an M, $million, which is allocated. And it's on, page 305 of the American Rescue Plan of 2021. So you are right on target. So thank you for bringing it up.
Thank you so much. I just feel that is so wrong when, like you said, I believe there are so many families out there who are really struggling with children, just to be able to get them back in a public school. And I thank you for taking my question, and you have a blessed day.
Well, I appreciate you calling in, and of course that will open up a line if some of you would like to ask a question, although I suspect many of you want to just kind of sit back and listen, and that is certainly appropriate as well. But Janet, thank you for bringing that up, and frankly, that is controversial, but it isn't half as controversial as some of the other things in the $1.9 trillion package in terms of funding. I think the one that a lot of people in California want to talk about is they want to build a tunnel for the DART train down there in the Bay Area and all sorts of stuff. I don't know. You can go on and on and on. Once you get sort of a must-pass piece of legislation, it's kind of like a Christmas tree, and everybody wants to put their ornaments on it. And there are many people that have been harshly critical of the fact that of that $1.9 trillion, a very little of it seemingly is going to actually the people that need it the most. And so that's an issue as well. Let me just mention for a minute, when we went to the break, I did mention that we have a take action item for the People Act. It passed the House of Representatives. It shouldn't have, but it did. And so now it's in the United States Senate. And one of the articles I've posted today is one that came out about 2 days ago by Mike Pence, the former vice president. It's entitled Election Integrity. Now, it's 4 pages, so I'm not going to read most of it, but he does say that after an election marked by significant voting irregularities and numerous instances of officials setting aside state law, he says, I share the concerns of millions of Americans about the integrity of 2020. And he points out that this bill, H.R. 1, would eliminate most of the safeguards that have actually existed in the past to actually protect the vote. Polling shows, interestingly enough, he points out that large numbers of Democrats did not trust the outcome of the 2016 election, and large numbers of Republicans still do not trust the outcome of the 2020 election. So he is quite ready to say that, yes, we need some things that are going to provide election integrity, but in some respects, as he points out, H.R. 1, this bill that we're asking you to contact your 2 senators about, mandates what he says the most questionable and abuse-prone election rules nationwide while banning common-sense measures to detect, deter, and prosecute election fraud. Here in the state of Texas, we have a judge and a couple of his cohorts that actually right now have been arrested for 150 counts of election fraud. You know, that stuff that supposedly never happens? Well, there are some very interesting cases taking place right now in the state from which I'm broadcasting. But if you say, well, that's Mike Pence, you know, they believe the so-called big lie and we can't trust them. Look at this piece from the Washington Post that came 2 days ago. The 2 senior legislative counsels at the American Civil Liberties Union. This is in the Washington Post. I didn't post this one, but you can find it very easily, in which they at first say, well, there are some things that we might have liked in the H.R. 1 for the People Act because it tries to address some issues of voting rights and election security and public campaign financing. But they then go on to say this bill contains significant flaws that are detrimental to the health of our democracy, will likely have unintended consequences on the political rights of non-citizen immigrants. They talk about the fact that in an attempt to try to deal with the so-called issue of dark money, they require the disclosure of donors who have given a certain amount of money. And, of course, they're concerned about what might happen to liberals that give that money. But you know as well as I do that oftentimes it's the conservatives or sometimes the Christians who give money that then get doxxed or they get their businesses targeted or something like that. And they even acknowledge, we know from history that people engaged in politically charged issues become political targets, you think, and are often subject to threats of harassment and even violence. And so this 2-page op-ed in the Washington Post from the ACLU tells you what is wrong with H.R. 1. Now, to be fair, they believe that maybe you can modify the bill enough so that they would actually support it. I disagree with that, but the point I'm making is when you have the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, saying that H.R. 1 is a bad idea, it's a bad idea. And so you can see whether it's Mike Pence on one side or the ACLU on another side. That's a reason why you should express your opinions to your 2 United States senators over H.R. 1. Just before we take a break, one of the things I did want to get into real quickly is the delay of vaccinated individuals. There were supposed to be vaccine guidelines from the CDC, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said they will not be releasing their guidelines. They have been having meetings and calls and all the rest, and it's kind of interesting because if you do the numbers, we have about 80 million shots have been jabbed into the arms of Americans. So the question a lot of people want to ask is, okay, if I have received 1 vaccination or maybe even 2, Johnson & Johnson's only one. By the way, we're going to talk about that next hour. We're going to get into vaccines a little bit with Jim Denison and some of the moral issues, but I'll postpone that later. But nevertheless, the issue is that they are not issuing these guidelines, and a lot of people have been trying to figure it out. They've had enough time to think about this, and is it that the public can't handle the truth? We sort of went through that, if you might remember, with the mask. But one of the arguments that people are making is maybe the problem is that if we do have vaccinated people that are given more freedom, we'd end up with a two-tiered society where the fully vaccinated could receive all sorts of rights and privileges that are different from those still waiting for vaccination. And so that is kind of an interesting idea that maybe we'll get into a little bit later. But I did want to point out that by now we were expected to have these vaccinated guidelines and to even tell those of you out there that maybe got a vaccine, as well as those of you that did not, what that means. Because if indeed vaccination would keep you from being a spreader, and there's pretty good evidence to suggest that is the case, or that it would substantially reduce the viral load, we're just not issuing the guidelines. And there may be some reasons for that, and we'll probably cover some of that a little bit later with our friend Jim Denison. But we need to take a break. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
And for a few more minutes, let me just mention at the top of the hour, Jim Denison is going to be with us. We're going to talk about a variety of issues, ranging from Christian nationalism to his piece today on vaccines and a variety of other topics that we will get into. Of course, we've had some ongoing hearings now about the riot in front of the Capitol, which is oftentimes called an insurrection, and so that'll get into some of the issues we'll talk about with him as well. So that will come in just a minute. And I just mentioned this idea of the vaccinations and who gets a vaccination, who does not. This comes from a piece that was written by the editors of the Wall Street Journal, Teachers Union Privilege. And I cited some of that a minute ago when we were talking with Janet, because you have the leader of the actual teachers union in Los Angeles arguing that the only people that want this are these white parents, and they're forcing the teachers to go back and they'll get killed and all that, which is, of course, crazy, because we've pointed out before that, first of all, the young children are the least likely to actually come down with any serious complications with COVID-19, and they're the least likely to be super spreaders, and there are all sorts of things we can do. But nevertheless, for those of you in the state of California, and we have quite a number of listeners out there, your governor, Gavin Newsom, has decided to prioritize teachers along with seniors. So if you're over the age of 65 or you're a teacher, you get a priority, and allocated quite a bit, I think about 10% of the supply just for teachers and education workers. And so here you have an interesting irony that the editors of the Wall Street Journal point out, that a 27-year-old teacher who lives with her 60-year-old parents will be inoculated before they are. And again, you just have all sorts of things that just from a moral point of view or a policy point of view aren't necessarily making sense. But it illustrates, I think, the power of the teachers' unions, which we've talked about on this program before. I've known Britt Hume since I had a chance to interview him and introduce him to an audience back in 1974. Boy, that makes me old. Was that 46 years ago? I mean, anyway, that's just amazing to me. But nevertheless, the other day he was interviewed, and he says, I've always known that the teachers union was powerful, but over the last week or so, I didn't realize how powerful that even when the new director of the CDC, who's a very brilliant woman from Harvard Medical School, said that it's fine to have the kids go back to school, almost immediately the Biden administration just issues this disclaimer. Well, she was speaking for herself. I mean, so fearful of the teachers union, it tells you a lot. But just before we take a break, I brought up yesterday the crisis on the border. And some of you listening right now are going to say, what crisis? I haven't heard anything about a crisis. That's because there's almost been a media blackout of that. And yesterday I pointed out that if indeed 1,000 attempted crossings a day was considered a crisis at the time when President Barack Obama was in office, how about 4,000 crosses a day? And it turns out I was incorrect. It's actually 6,000 crosses a day. Now, to be fair, the number I was looking at were the fact that the Border Patrol the other day encountered about 4,700 people trying to illegally enter the United States on one day. Okay, that's 4,700. What I didn't know is that they also had another 900 that they observed but were not detained. And in addition to that, there were another 400 that were detained and then sent back. So 900 plus 400, what's that, 1,300. You add 1,300 to 4,700, and that's 6,000. So if indeed it was considered a crisis under the Obama administration when you had 1,000 people a day crossing the border, what is it when you have 6,000 a day crossing the border? Oops. And by the way, I did not know this until I saw this by James Carafano at the Heritage Foundation. Who put that standard together? Well, that would be, at that time, the vice president, Joe Biden, who's now the president, and then was the Deputy Secretary, Alejandro Mayorkas, who's now the Secretary of Homeland Security. So the two people that are denying it's a crisis were the ones that was saying a crisis when it was 1,000 at the border, which leads me to my first article so that you can read some other things than what the press is talking about. This is a piece that is covering some of the material that Representative Henry Cuellar, who's a Democrat, from Texas, lives down in that region, in which he was so concerned that people were minimizing the crisis that he actually sent pictures to the Houston Chronicle of
Customs and Border Protection facility crowded not just with men, but also with women and young children, trying to drive home that this is a crisis. And he said, I had to release those pictures because they, that is the administration, were keeping it very, very quiet. He goes on to say, quote, I'm a Democrat and I support this administration. I supported the Obama administration, but sometimes I think they need to do more and listen to border communities. And he points out the fact that his real concern is that right now the administration seems to be listening to some of these activists. Matter of fact, his quote is, the Biden administration's only listening to the activists at the expense of border communities. He goes on to say it's okay to listen to the immigration activists and advocates, but the other side of the formula is to listen to the border communities, and you've got to balance your approach when you listen to both sides and not just the immigration activists that many times live thousands of miles away from the border. So he is very concerned about that. He also is convinced, absolutely convinced, that this is not by accident, but by design. For those of you that live in the state of Texas or are familiar with geography, he says that in the Del Rio sector, for example, most of the people coming across are Cubans and Haitians. In the Laredo sector, at least as a week ago, 73% coming there were Mexican single adults. And then in the Rio Grande Valley, most of those are family units or unaccompanied kids. So he says, why is it that different folks go to different sectors by accident? No, it's by design. If you don't think you are being played, you need to pay more attention. And that's part of what we talk about so often here, to having a level of discernment about some of these very important issues. And so when we come back from the break, we're going to spend some time talking with Jim Denison. He wrote a piece a while back on this idea of Christian nationalism. It surfaced after the storming of the Capitol. So we'll get into that, and we'll get into some of the hearings that have been, I think, eye-opening and help us understand that the phrase insurrection is used time and time again. Armed insurrection when there's no evidence of that. So we'll get into some of those issues. And then, of course, his most recent piece came out today about the vaccine, some of the ethical questions that people are raising about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So we're going to get into that because he brings a bioethics training there as well. And we'll talk about some of those guidelines. And as always, we'll open up for your comments or questions. But as we go to a break, perfect time for you to go to our website, pointofview.net, or to look for the email that you'll know likely will receive, in which we are encouraging you to contact your two members of the United States Senate. These are individuals now that will be considering what has been called the For the People Act. It's H.R. 1. We give you quite a bit of information about it and what it would do. It would essentially federalize these statewide elections and take, I think, some of the worst practices from the 2020 election and require those for all 50 states. So that's the first issue. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to learn a little bit more, go to the website and you can read some of that material. Then you put in your zip code, as I'm doing right now. Up pops your two United States senators and a possible letter. And you can edit the letter as you wish. And then eventually, when you're done, hit the button that says submit, and you will have had a chance to contact both of them. Last couple of days, we've been talking about the Equality Act. We may come back to that again, but we thought it was appropriate now to talk about the For the People Act, or the attempt to take the worst practices of the elections last time and implement them nationwide. And so we encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net, and take some action. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This hour we're going to spend some time, if we can, looking at a variety of different issues, many of which have been surfaced by Jim Denison. His piece that came out actually almost 2 months ago on the whole issue of Christian nationalism is something I've been studying. As a matter of fact, I actually have a whole file here in which you have seen that some Christians have said, we need to talk about Christian nationalism, so we will. But at the same time, I want to try to be real careful, because I've seen how this has been used by people that disagree with everything that we say around this table. There's a piece here from USA Today. Christian nationalism is a threat, not just from capital attackers invoking Jesus. And now this is talking about painting with a broad brush and claiming all sorts of things, including we're moving towards a theocracy. And sometimes you just can't even believe these people live in the same world as you. So we will talk about that issue of Christian nationalism and try to be careful not to overplay it, but at the same time cause us to, value and think about where are our allegiances in terms of Christians. So that's important. The piece that Jim Denison has coming out today, should you avoid the Johnson & Johnson vaccine? And that is because there are a number of groups, Catholic groups like the Archdiocese of New Orleans, evangelical groups like Randy Alcorn and others that are saying there's some real concerns about the way in which that vaccine was derived using abortion or stem cells and things of that nature. So we'll talk about that, and that will get us into that, as well as some of these guidelines on the vaccine, which I think are kind of intriguing as well. So those are some topics we will get to. But as a way to sort of set up the conversation about Christian nationalism, much of that surfaced after the attack on the Capitol, which took place, as we now know, January 6th. We were on the air as we were hearing about that, and very quickly people were calling it an insurrection. So a piece that I thought might help us understand what we're talking about comes from Byron York. The second time in 2 days I've been quoting from our friend Byron York there at Washington Examiner, but he does such a good job, we might as well. And he did a search of newspapers and websites and cable news transcripts using Nexus and found that the word armed insurrection surfaced 2,339 times. And the question that he raised is, was it an armed insurrection? First of all, I think the word insurrection was deliberately used to create fear. You have people like even Glenn Greenwald, who, again, as I've pointed out before, kind of an independent journalist, kind of left of center, nevertheless is very concerned that he's seeing the same kind of drumbeat for going after domestic terrorists as he saw before the drumbeat going after Islamic terrorists, which caused many of us to lose some of our rights and freedoms and responsibilities. And the question is, when you talk about insurrectionists and armed insurrectionists, it is very clear that while it was true that there were some rioters that had baseball bats or bear spray, and some other things, as far as I can determine, none of them had firearms. But that came out yesterday when we were actually listening to some of the back and forth that took place as there was a hearing in which you had Jill Sanborn, who's the FBI Assistant Director on Counterterrorism, and in the Counterterrorism Division. This was a hearing held in the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs. And so you have Republican Senator Ron Johnson ask, how many firearms were confiscated in the Capitol or on the Capitol grounds during that day? And Jill Sanborn said, to my knowledge, we have not recovered any on that day from any other arrest on the scene at this point. But I don't want to speak on behalf of Metro and Capitol Police, but to my knowledge, none. Then, of course, Representative or Senator Johnson said, so nobody has been charged with an actual firearm weapon in the Capitol or the Capitol grounds. And again, Jill Sanborn says, correct. The closest we came was the vehicle that they had found where there might have been one. Then he says, okay, how many shots were fired that we know of? Again, Jill Sanborn says, I believe the only shots that were fired were the ones that resulted in the death of one lady. Now, if you're not familiar, that one lady is Ashley Babbitt, who was killed actually by a single bullet fired by a Capitol Police officer. It turns out that there was only one firearms case that Sanborn did not mention, and that is an accused rioter named Christopher Alberts, who was seen on the Capitol grounds, and that's about at 7:25 p.m. the night of the riot. Police noticed a bulge in his jacket, that they thought was a gun. They approached him. He ran away. When they caught him, they did indeed have a 9mm handgun and an extra magazine. He was charged with an unlawful possession of a firearm on Capitol grounds or buildings, plus a weapons offenses. But he seems to be the only person that was charged with a gun on the Capitol grounds. So the point I'm making is you're going to and have heard time and time again an armed insurrection, and yet the reality is what we're talking about is a riot. Now, one of the things that Byron York also pointed out is that we still don't know some of the basic facts of the riot. We don't know the facts surrounding the death of the one Capitol Police officer, Brian Sicknick. But again, the perpetuate, I guess I better should say it this way, the argument that was perpetuated and the claim that was perpetuated is that he was hit by a fire extinguisher and was taken to the hospital. None of that is true. As a matter of fact, we now have the records of his family pointing out that he actually talked to them after this. He may have been hit by bear spray, but other than that, he was fine, but then later had a heart attack. And so this is another attempt to try to make this particular riot in the Capitol seem more violent than it is. Don't get us wrong. The riot was wrong. The storming of the Capitol was wrong. But this whole idea that we need to come up with something that is more menacing, I think, is part of the narrative that continually gets repeated, even though there are no facts to support it. And I think it is being done to justify eventually having a domestic war on domestic terrorists, and to actually implement some of the kinds of things against what are identified as domestic terrorists, which could be very broadly defined, as some people are concerned about, that we would lose some of the same kind of rights, liberties, and protections and allow for more and more surveillance, which happened after, of course, 9/11. When we come back from the break, though, I also, since we have a moment before we get a chance to talk with our friend Jim Denison, want to also get into the theory that was put forward by the FBI Director, Christopher Wray. It's something that has been talked about before. Were there just all one group of individuals that were Trump supporters? Or, as the FBI Director points out, were there three different groups, some of which maybe even got caught up in the activity? We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
No doubt you've heard the phrase politics is downstream from culture. It is a way of explaining that what is at stake in our world often begins upstream in the culture. Popular culture is all around us and delivered to us through broadcast media and social media. We perceive the world through news reports, through movies, through entertainment programs, and through music. Every form of communication has a message. Sometimes it's blatant and intentional. Often it is subtle and not even perceived by the artist, actor, musician, or broadcaster. He or she may simply be telling a story, but that story comes from a worldview perspective. A wise and discerning Christian should frequently ask, what message is being delivered? Is the viewpoint true or false? How does it line up with biblical principles? Well, let's face it, many of us merely accept what we read, see, and hear uncritically. And that brings us to politics. We are bombarded by messages every day. Most Americans watch lots of television, listen to a fair amount of music, and visit various websites. Unless they are approaching all of the entertainment with lots of discernment, they'll begin to accept the worldview perspective of the writer, the actor, the director, the musician who controls the story and the perspective. Most of these stories come from a liberal, secular viewpoint that often becomes easier to embrace. If someone stood up and lectured to you about abortion, homosexuality, gender identity, your guard would be up. But if the stories portray liberals, feminists, and gays in a positive light, they get into our head and emotions. And if they portray conservatives and Christians in a negative light, the same thing happens. All this to say that we need to pay attention to popular culture because politics is downstream from culture. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, yesterday there were some very important issues that were being used to evaluate what was happening in front of the Capitol on January 6th. And so this was a very important series of discussions taking place with the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs hearing. I mentioned just a minute ago, of course, the back and forth between the Senator Ron Johnson and also Jill Sanborn, who is the FBI Assistant Director for the Counterterrorism Division. For just a few more minutes before we move on, I wanted to also talk about the testimony that took place at that day by the FBI Director, Christopher Wray. He didn't answer a lot of questions, and that was, in some respects, very frustrating. But if nothing else, there was a question from the Senator Ted Cruz from Texas, a Republican. What do we know about the planning and coordination that occurred surrounding the January 6th attack? And so he wanted to, that is, the FBI director, Christopher, wanted to, quote, step back and in a sense say that there were three different groups. You know, there's been a theory running around for some time that what you had was a small group of individuals that really wanted to actually bring about a riot, that then because of that, there were all sorts of other people that sort of got caught up in all of that. Ron Johnson himself said, we're seeing a mixture of individuals, and even Jill Sandburn herself said, we're seeing people that got caught up in the moment, got caught up in the sort of energy, made their way into the Capitol, and those are probably the ones you're seeing the charges simply of trespassing. Then we're definitely seeing some that were a smaller group that were charged with conspiracy. Well, the FBI director, Christopher Wray, said essentially the same thing. If you want to actually number from 1 to 3, he identifies 3 different groups. And if you can think of an inverted pyramid, so the first group is the largest, the last group is the smallest. The largest group, group number 1, he said, is the group that we need to spend the least time talking about. He said this is a peaceful, sometimes maybe rowdy protesters, but they weren't necessarily violating the law. Those would be the people that Jill Sandburn talked about that were actually there, but maybe only charged with trespassing. Then let's go to group number 2. And he says, think of this as a reverse pyramid. The second group are those who may have come intending to just be part of a peaceful protest, but they got swept up in terms of motive and emotion, or whatever, engaged in any kind of low-level criminal behavior. Trespass, say, on the Capitol grounds, but maybe not necessarily breaching the building, but they're still engaged in criminal conduct. Those would be the people that you saw standing around afterwards. Maybe they were even the ones that were pushing on the attempts to move the barricades, but that's that second group. So the first group just sort of got caught up in it. They may not have even been on the Capitol grounds per se, or at least on the Capitol itself. Second group, they were there, but maybe did not breach the building. And then you have the third group, which he says is the smallest group numerically. But he says by far and away the most serious group. These are the ones who breached the Capitol grounds. These are the ones that engaged in violence against law enforcement. These are the ones that attempted to disrupt the members of Congress and the conduct of their constitutional responsibilities. He went on to say, and of those, some of those people clearly came to Washington, we now know, with plans and intentions to engage in the worst kind of violence that we would consider domestic terrorism. And so some of that coordination appears to have been coordinated travel, coordinated meeting up, coordinated in terms of what kind of gear they might be wearing or bringing with them, that kind of thing. And so that gives you a little bit of a summary of this. But as I've pointed out before, you can find 2,300 times in which the phrase armed insurrection appears either in a newspaper, in a website, or from transcripts from cable news. And first of all, it was not armed, as we now know, and as has been well documented by an individual with, of course, the FBI Counterterrorism Division and by the FBI director himself. Number 2, an insurrection may have been a little bit of a stronger statement, given the fact that most of the people there were not trying to engage in anything that would look like an insurrection, but just caught up in the moment. They are going to be punished, and they have been cited, but that is very different. And I think it's fair to point out that Christopher Wray, the FBI director, did not attach any numbers to the groups, except to say that the most criminally culpable group was that small number 3 group that we talked about. But again, you're hearing some things, I suspect, here on Point of View that you've not heard elsewhere. So I just wanted to cover some of those issues, and even if we have not had a chance to connect up with Jim Denison, I want to maybe quote from one of the pieces that he has posted today, because now we have a third vaccine by Johnson & Johnson. It's a single dose. It's somewhat of a game changer in the sense that it only requires the first dose, but at the same time, its percentage of protection may not be quite as good as Pfizer or Moderna. But nevertheless, you've had individuals saying that we should be encouraged that we now have 3 excellent vaccines available. But now the but comes, are these particular types of vaccines different than others. The concern has come from pro-life groups that when we have used fetal tissue or stem cells from aborted fetuses, does that raise a very important moral question? I think that it does as a pro-life person. And the argument being made right now is that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is morally compromised because it uses a cell line derived from abortion. This is not new information. This is something we mentioned months ago when the research was being done. When the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines were developed a number of months ago, they were used from a fetal cell line called HEK293T. Don't need to know that other than to know that we know which line that is. It's hard to determine whether or not any of that came from an elective abortion or spontaneous miscarriage because it was acquired from the Netherlands back in the 1970s. The likelihood is not. By contrast, though, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine makes, and I'm now quoting from some of the Catholic groups on this, as well as some of the evangelicals, quote, extensive use of abortion-derived cell lines, unquote. And so as a result, you've had several Christian leaders, some Protestant, some Catholic, quite a number in the evangelical world as well, that even wrote back to the U.S. Department of Food and Drug Administration back a year ago, April of 2020, warning that Janssen Pharmaceuticals was developing a vaccine using old cell lines that were created from the cells of aborted babies. As I've said before, this is not new information. We've known this for some time, and so that is the case. And that is why a number of individuals have said, if I have a pro-life perspective, I am more likely to want to use a Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna vaccine and not the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Now, I'll be the first to admit that a good number of you do not want to take the vaccine, and I understand that too. I'm not trying to necessarily make that argument at the moment, but I am trying to make the argument that some very significant individuals who are actually looking at this now are actually raising some pro-life concerns about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which, of course, for people that aren't necessarily pro-life oriented, probably haven't even crossed their mind. But that is something I wanted to bring up so that you could hear about that. And if you would like to read it in its entirety, it is today's issue of the Daily Article by Dr. Jim Denison. As an individual that oftentimes sits on a board dealing with bioethical issues, I thought you would appreciate some of the material that he has there. Also, he's quoting from research done by the Notre Dame University, New Orleans Archdiocese, and a number of others. So if you wanted to know more about that, that is part of the Daily Article, and you, of course, can find that on his website as well. Let me take a break. When we come back, we have a lot more to cover. I haven't even begun to tap all the other resources we're going to try to get into, but let me mention one more time that indeed we have the Take Action item today. If you'd like to read more about that, of course, there's quite a bit of information on that Take Action item, but I've also posted as our third article a very good piece. It goes on for 4 pages by the former Vice President Mike Pence on election integrity. And your 2 United States senators need to hear from you, so I encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net, and make your opinion known to them. We'll take a break and be back with more right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. You might remember earlier in the week we had Craig Denison on as we talked about this excellent book, Living Intentionally. Such a good book that I'm going to cover it this Sunday in my Sunday school class at Prestonwood Baptist Church because there's such great insight there from him. And if you haven't had enough from one Denison, you got another Denison because Dr. Jim Denison, the father of Craig Denison, is with us now. And, of course, he's with Denison Ministries and in particular the Denison Forum. We've posted a piece which we're going to get to in just a minute on the issue of why I am a Christian patriot but not a Christian nationalist. It is something we've been wanting to get to for some time. But Jim, one of the things that we've been talking about before you joined us here is your daily article today, Should You Avoid the Johnson & Johnson Vaccine? So first of all, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
I am delighted to be back on with you today, Kerby. Thanks so much for the privilege. I won't be the most popular Denison in this conversation, I would imagine, but I'm happy to try.
Well, let's, if we can, use your expertise, both as an individual with a doctorate from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, as somebody who sits on a board looking at bioethical issues, to address this for just a minute. I tried to cover some of it before you joined us, but again, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is different for a couple of reasons. Number one, it only requires one dose, whereas Moderna and Pfizer require two, but also it is something that our Catholic friends and even some of our evangelical friends have called morally compromised. And there were a number of Christian leaders about this time last year that wrote to the Food and Drug Administration warning that Janssen Pharmaceuticals were developing a vaccine using cell lines that were created from the cells of aborted babies. That seems to be much greater concern than some of the concerns that people have raised about Pfizer and Moderna. Can you tell us more?
Absolutely, and I'm so glad you're making that distinction between the two. As regards Pfizer and Moderna, as we understand, there was some testing relative to fetal lines that may or may not have originated with aborted fetuses. Has to do with a specific line that started in the Netherlands back in the 1970s, but records pertaining to the origins were lost. So we don't know if the tissue came from elective abortion or from spontaneous miscarriage. Nonetheless, with the Moderna and the Pfizer, there was some testing in the context of that fetal cell line. The allegation this time is that Janssen Pharmaceuticals, which produced Johnson & Johnson, actually used those cell lines more directly, that they used those in some way that more included them in the actual development of the vaccine itself. Now, they disagree with that. They're claiming that, in fact, there was no fetal tissue anywhere in the vaccine. They're also stating that the cells in question were clones and not the original fetal tissue. There are a number of Catholic moral theologians that I quoted in the article who disagree with the concern of the Archdiocese in New Orleans that's raising this issue. So there seems to be a lot of kind of confusion about the issue, even inside the Roman Catholic world, in terms of the context of this vaccine and abortion itself.
And I might just mention, I won't spend a lot more time on it since we did talk about it a little bit, that there's a little bit of back and forth, but oftentimes people have the philosophy that when in doubt, don't. In other words, since there aren't questions about Pfizer and Moderna, other than the obvious questions, Jim, that people have about whether they're going to take the vaccine at all, but the so-called, if you will, pro-life concerns have always centered mostly on Johnson & Johnson, and Randy Alcorn has written about this, you've written about it, and others, so I did want people to know that if they go today and get the daily article, you will have some great material. And frankly, that's a good example of why you just need to subscribe. So you'll get it in your inbox every single day. And that is, again, a resource. If you're not familiar with Denison Forum or Denison Ministries, just click on the picture of Jim Denison, denisonforum.org. You will actually find that article there, and there's a place for you to subscribe, and I would encourage you to do so. So let's get to the topic we were going to focus on, and that is the issue of Christian nationalism. Ever since you wrote about that in January, I have a file, hold it up for everybody here. I've got a whole file on Christian nationalism because I really wanted to see everything's being written. There is things being written by Paul Miller in Christianity Today. There are articles that have come out by our good friend Ed Stetzer at Wheaton College, but that it also has been used by people that are very critical of Christians. This one in USA Today, Christian nationalism is a threat, not just from the Capitol attackers invoking Jesus. So there's a sense in which we kind of have to plow our way through that, but I think you do a good job of explaining that there's a fundamental difference between being a Christian patriot and a Christian nationalist. Can you help us with that?
Thank you for giving us that opportunity, because it really is vital to the conversation. So a patriot is someone who loves the country. A patriot is someone who's ready to boldly support it and defend it. I certainly am strongly in that category. My father fought for America in World War II, my grandfather in World War I. I can't be more grateful for the sacrifices of so many that have been made so that I and you can live in freedom. And so a patriot is someone who absolutely loves the country. I would say that's a biblical motive. We're called in Scripture to pray for our leaders. We're called in the book of Jeremiah to seek the welfare of the place where we find ourselves. So in my mind, patriotism and the Bible most certainly do align. Now, nationalism is understood as the belief that people live best when they're segregated into nations with unifying religions, languages, cultures, ethnicities. Nationalists then claim these groups should have their own governments, promote their own specific cultural identity, work to defend themselves from others. Christian nationalism then merges Christianity and this American nationalism. It claims America is a uniquely Christian nation. It claims the federal government should advocate biblical values, that America should privilege Christianity with regard to other religions, that our leaders, national leaders, should privilege Christian morality and Christian beliefs. And sometimes, and we saw this on January 6th, can move to a very militant sort of response, a taking back America, and a sense that we're defending the country when really we're defending a version of nationalism, which is not Christianity.
You know, scripturally, we recognize that our citizenship is in heaven, but we also have a citizenship here on earth, and sometimes that gets mixed up. You know, a while back we had Doug Groteis on, and we talked about Augustine and the city of God, city of man. In some respects, it is important for us as Christians to figure out how we sort that out. And can you maybe give us some direction that way?
Thank you, because that's such a balance, and that's the challenge inside this, isn't it? On the one side, I'm absolutely convinced that the founders believed that the democracy they were building stood upon a consensual morality that required religious underpinnings. You think of George Washington's farewell address, where he said religion and democracy are inescapably dependent. And there's the sense that John Adams makes clear that our Constitution's intended for a moral and religious people and is wholly unsuited to the governance of any other. We can't govern each other without a kind of a north on the compass and a consensual morality. At the same time, the founders also made it clear in the First Amendment, the government's not to privilege one religion over another. Article 6 states that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust. So we have this balance in America that we're a place where all men are created equal, where those of all creeds and none are equally to be understood as valid in the secular democracy. But at the same time, we have a history in a Judeo-Christian worldview that was vital to our founding, and I think is vital to morality still today. So there's this balance that we're trying to maintain, and it's a bit of a challenge.
Let's, if we can, just before we take a break, talk about, as you talk about here, 3 ways to help people follow Jesus, because a lot of it has to do with what we are trusting in. Are we trusting in Jesus? Or are we trusting in our country? And most importantly, how we can, in a civil society, make a difference and really enforce and even try to promote Christian morality.
And that's the point. A nation really can't be Christian. A nation doesn't have a soul. A nation can't be saved. It's really not so much can America be a Christian nation, but can Americans be Christians? That's really, I think, our Great Commission calling. So first, obviously, we trust Jesus for our salvation and sanctification. Second, we trust Jesus to change human hearts, something no political leader, no party can do. No party can save souls or convict of sins. That only Jesus can do that. And third, love Jesus enough to love everyone he loves, and thus do the hard work of influencing our culture, one person at a time. That's a challenge, but that's the call that God has on our lives today.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into a little bit more. If you would like to know more about this, we have posted this piece. It actually came out January 12th, but we've made it very easy and have posted it as this idea of Christian nationalism. It is something that I've, again, want to say I don't want to overplay this, because I've seen some that are now using this saying, well, Christian nationalists are wanting to create a theocracy, one even making the argument that Christian nationalism nationalists have put forward all sorts of legislation to make this a Christian nation. And again, maybe sometimes the rhetoric goes a little bit too far, but I think it is important for us to make sure that we make that distinction and understand who we trust in. My problem oftentimes is not that people are too politically involved. It is that they're not involved enough. If you ask the average person who their member of Congress is, they probably can't even tell you. If you don't know who your 2 United States senators are, we've made it pretty easy for you today because we're encouraging you to contact them about this H.R. 1, which is a bill which is called For the People Act that passed already the House of Representatives. It did last year, something very similar to it, and it's now in front of the Senate. So we encourage you to contact your 2 senators about your concerns about this attempt to nationalize the elections. And, of course, a couple of days ago, we encouraged you to contact your 2 senators about the Equality Act. We'll come back and talk about some of those issues right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Jim Denison with us for a few more minutes, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Sometimes I'd like to have him here for a whole hour because so many of you like to ask questions, and having had lunch with him one time and being able to learn so much from him, it is a great blessing, and so you are participating in that opportunity right now as we have Jim Denison with us. So let's go to Georgia. Shelby, I think you have a very good question for Dr. Denison.
Hi, I'm trying to understand. So we're supposed to allow Jesus to work on people's hearts, but in the meantime, what are we supposed to do? Because if that was the case, why did we leave England and come to a country to start a new country? freedom of religion from the state?
Well, I think that's a good question, because a lot of times we say, well, we'll just let God change their heart, or we'll just preach the gospel. But we have not only, of course, an evangelistic opportunity, but Christians should be good citizens and should use persuasion to try to help people see the value of the views that we are trying to actually implement into various kinds of legal and political institutions, right?
Oh, absolutely, Kirby. Thank you for that. And Shelby, thank you for that. It's a terrific question because, Kirby, you're exactly right. That's our balance, isn't it? I'm convinced that God's calling more Christians into public service and are answering the call. We're to be salt and light as regards the entirety of what God's word says to the issues of our day. We're to be prophetic in speaking to the cultural about a whole host of issues that are before us, not just what we think of as salvation per se. At the same time, we're to do that in the context of religious freedom that allows people of all creeds and none to participate. That doesn't try to enforce our views through some sort of legislative kind of imposition. And so there is this balance here. We certainly want our government to reflect the biblical morality that we think we believe in the context of religious freedom, but we want to do that through the processes that are before us, by being elected to office, by persuading people through political recourse and political concourse and so forth. So there really is this balance. We need to be activistic and engaged, but ultimately what we're about is leading people to Jesus.
Let's, if we can, talk for just a minute about the idea of courage, maybe commitment, compromise, and the rest. You know, a couple of weeks ago, we had this ice storm down here in the snowstorm, and then the week after, I left for Alaska because I wanted to warm up. It was actually warmer in Alaska than it was here. And when I was up there the whole time speaking, I was talking about this issue of courage and compromise because I said, you know, as the pressure of this culture comes against us, there's going to be a tendency for people to compromise. And if I can quote you from a couple of days ago, you talked about the fact that America's largest Christian adoption agency will now be working with LGBTQ parents. And you talk about that as being kind of an example of the peril of separating values from actions, of maybe recognizing that our days of religious liberty may be sometimes being affected by government. And so it's going to be even more important for us to make sure that we don't compromise and that we have this virtue, which is in short supply right now, courage to stand up for our values, to do it both in truth and love. Talk about that, if you might.
Kirby, I believe that's our future on a level that may be unprecedented in American history. You know, we across recent decades have seen a variety of issues for which we're very, very much grief, whether it's abortion, whether it's same-sex marriage, whether it's so-called death with dignity acts and so forth. But no one's requiring us to participate. No one's telling you that if you have a conscientious or religious objection to abortion, you have to perform an abortion anyway. No one's saying that churches have to do same-sex weddings or that faith-based hospitals have to do sex change operations, that sort of thing. Well, what we're seeing right now is a move that says that LGBTQ protection should be elevated to civil rights status. That's the Equality Act and so forth. And if we disagree, we're being as bigoted and prejudiced as if we were racists. If I came along and wanted to cite religious liberty protections as a KKK member or in order to slander people in terms of racial discrimination, that would be wrong. Well, the culture, many in the culture, are seeing me in exactly that same way as regards biblical values. So if I'm claiming religious freedom to hold what I think is biblical morality, they're saying that I'm appealing erroneously or improperly to religious values. That's what the Equality Act threatens. That's the larger trajectory we're up against, is that increasingly we're seen as dangerous to the culture. There was a day when the church was central, then it became peripheral. Now we're seen as dangerous, religion as dangerous. I think it was Richard Dawkins that said religion is a virus in the software of humanity that must be expunged. That, I'm afraid, is in some ways what our future is looking like, and courage will be more necessary than ever.
Well, again, if people want to have wisdom and especially discernment so that they can develop courage and not be compromised, then I would encourage them, first of all, to go to the denisonforum.org, and you can find some of the great material there on the daily article. But just a few days ago, we had the head of Denison Ministries, which is the umbrella organization over all of those. And I would encourage people to go there, because if they go to some of those brands. One in particular is the brand that we talked about just the other day, first15.org. You can give this excellent book by your son, Craig Denison, on living courageously. But talk about some of the resources that you have there, because, again, I want people to be able to read some of the great material that you are putting together, that your family, your wife, your sons, and others are doing. And so what would they find when they land at those websites?
Kerby, thank you so much. You're always so gracious, and I'm really grateful to you for that privilege. So our larger calling is to build a movement of culture-shaping Christians, of Christians who will be fully alive in Christ and take action and use their influence to make a difference for Christ. So Denison Forum, where I work more specifically, helps people think culturally and biblically so they can use their influence for the kingdom. First 15 helps people engage every day in a transforming encounter with the Lord so they can be empowered to make a difference in the culture. Christian Parenting helps parents raise Christians to know and love the Lord as the next generation in our nation and its future. My wife's Bible study materials, Jen at Denison.org, enable individuals and ladies in Bible studies to be equipped through systematic exposition of God's Word. And then Pastor's View is our leadership brand that helps pastors and leaders engage cultural issues in the context of their influence. And all of that's available under the brand or the larger umbrella website, Denison Ministries. That's where the various brands can be accessed, or each of those individually as well.
Again, denisonforum.org is where you will find, of course, the article that we talked about today in terms of the vaccine, and I think you will appreciate that counterpoint there. And then we've posted one, or you could go do a search to find the January 12th one on being a Christian patriot but not a Christian nationalist, and so those are all great resources from our good friend Jim Denison. And once again, thank your son, Craig, for such a great job, for such a great book, and thank you for giving us some time today here on Point of View.
Kerby, such a privilege always to be with you. So grateful for your ministry, your gifts, your heart, and just a privilege to work with you.
Well, we're going to take a break, and then tomorrow is our weekend edition. So we'll be covering, I think we got a deep state on the mind, the liberal mind. We're going to talk about capitalism, socialism. We'll get into a few other issues. Matter of fact, I never got around to this piece by Doug Groteis on phobias and logic, because that's a very good piece we wanted you to know about in terms of critical thinking. And, of course, we've posted the piece already by the former Vice President Mike Pence on election integrity, which relates back to our action item for today. Last couple of days, our action item has been on the Equality Act. You heard Jim Denison talk about that. Our action item today, and probably tomorrow, will be the For the People Act, which is now passed the House of Representatives, H.R. 1, and is now in the Senate. So if you'd like to know more about that, you can find that on the website, pointofview.net. And let me also mention my Viewpoints commentary today is on politics and culture. You can click on that button and have a chance to read that. But also, there's a button where it says never miss a viewpoint, and you can sign up and receive mine in your inbox Monday through Friday, Penedextures on Saturday, and all of that is available at the website pointofview.net. Well, we've covered a lot, but you know what? We haven't covered everything, so that will be something we will just have to postpone till tomorrow. But there is some great material that we've posted today. I hope you'll take the time to read it, print it out, maybe pass it on to others, and I hope that you will join us tomorrow. I want to thank Andrew and Steve, and we'll see you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.